Steve Harvey drops the microphone, walks off the stage, and takes the arm of an elderly man. All 200 people in the studio hold their breath. The cameras are still rolling. The game board lights are flashing. But for the first time in Family Feud history, the show has completely stopped. Not because of a technical issue. Not because of a contestant meltdown. But because Steve Harvey, the man who hosts one of the most fast-paced, high-energy shows on television, has just heard something that made him forget every rule, every cue, every script. And 78-year-old grandfather, standing at the contestant podium with trembling hands, has just whispered 7 words that will change everything. I never got to say goodbye to him. The studio goes silent. The producers in the control room freeze. Steve's smile, the one he wears like armor through every joke and every punchline, disappears. And in that moment, what happens next isn't television. It's something far more sacred. But to understand why Steve Harvey walked away from his own show, we need to go back 90 minutes earlier, when a man named Earl Thompson walked into that studio carrying a weight he'd been holding for half a century. It was a Tuesday afternoon taping in Los Angeles. The Family Feud studio was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy. 2 families were warming up, practicing their buzzers, joking with each other. The Thompson family had driven in from a small town in Montana, 3 generations crammed into 2 rental cars, making this their big family vacation. Earl Thompson, the patriarch, sat quietly in the green room while his children and grandchildren laughed and rehearsed their strategy. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a brown cardigan his late wife had given him 30 years ago, pressed slacks, and shoes he'd polished that morning in the hotel room. His hands, rough from decades of carpentry work, rested on his knees. One of the producers noticed him sitting alone. "You okay, Mr. Thompson?" she asked gently. Earl nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "Just thinking about someone who should be here," he said quietly. The producer smiled politely and moved on. She had no idea what those words meant. No one did. Not yet. When the Thompson family was called to the stage, the energy was electric. Steve Harvey bounded out with his signature swagger, microphone in hand, ready to bring the laughs and the chaos. He greeted the family with his usual warmth, shaking hands, cracking jokes, making everyone feel like they were part of something special. "All right, Thompson family from Montana," Steve bellowed. "You all ready to play?" The family erupted in cheers. But Earl, standing at the end of the line, just smiled softly and nodded. Steve noticed. He always notices. That's what makes him different. Beneath all the humor and the showmanship, Steve Harvey is a man who reads people. And something about Earl's quiet demeanor caught his attention. "And who do we have here?" Steve asked, walking over to Earl. "I'm Earl, Steve. Earl Thompson." His voice was steady but soft. "Earl. How old are you, sir?" 78. The audience clapped. Steve grinned. 78 and still playing Family Feud. That's what I'm talking about. What's your secret, Earl? Earl looked at Steve for a long moment. And then he said something that Steve would later describe as the moment everything shifted. "I promised someone I'd do this," Earl said quietly. 50 years ago. Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. There was something in the way Earl said it. Not with drama. Not looking for sympathy. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of quiet gravity that only comes from a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time. Steve's instinct as a host is to keep things moving, to pivot into humor, to maintain the energy. But in that moment, his instinct as a human being took over. "Hold on," Steve said, raising his hand to the producers. "Hold on just a second." The music stopped. The audience, sensing something different, went quiet. Even the other family members on stage turned to look at Earl. Steve stepped closer. "Who'd you promise, Earl?" Earl's jaw tightened. His eyes, already glassy, began to fill. "My little brother," he said, his voice cracking. His name was Tommy. The studio was so silent you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Steve set his microphone down on the podium. That alone was shocking. Steve Harvey never sets the mic down. But he did. And then he walked over to Earl, stood right in front of him, and said, "Tell me about Tommy. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Earl took a shaky breath. "Tommy was 14 years younger than me. I was 22 when he was born. I was already married, had a job, starting my life. But man, I loved that kid. He looked up to me like I was some kind of hero." Steve nodded, his full attention on Earl. "When Tommy was 8, I got a job offer 3 states away. Good money. Chance to build something. I took it. Told Tommy I'd be back for his birthday. Told him we'd go to a game show taping together someday. He loved game shows. Used to watch them every day after school." Earl paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. His daughter, standing next to him, reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "I didn't make it back for his birthday. Work kept me too busy. Then it was Christmas. Then it was Easter. I kept saying next time. You know how it goes." Steve nodded again. He knew. "One night," Earl continued, his voice breaking, "my mom called. Tommy had been hit by a car riding his bike home from school. He didn't make it." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Several people were already crying. "I never got to say goodbye," Earl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never got to tell him I was sorry. I never got to keep my promise." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He turned to the control room and made a slashing motion across his throat, the universal sign to cut everything. "Stop the clock. Stop the game. Stop the show." The producers were stunned. This was live to tape. They were on a schedule. There were contractual obligations. But Steve didn't care. He turned back to Earl and said, "So you're here for him?" Earl nodded. "This was the promise. I told him we'd be on a game show together. I know it's 50 years late, but I'm here." Steve Harvey, the man who has made millions of people laugh, who has built an empire on humor and quick wit, stood on that stage and cried. Not a tear or two. Real, deep, shoulder-shaking emotion. And then he did something no one expected. He took off his suit jacket. His burgundy, custom-tailored, Steve Harvey collection jacket. He walked over to Earl, draped it over the old man's shoulders, and said, "Tommy's here, Earl. I promise you he's here." The audience erupted. Not in applause. In something deeper. A collective release of emotion. People weren't just crying, they were sobbing. The rival family on the other side of the stage walked over and hugged Earl. Steve's crew members, who had worked on the show for years, stood at the edge of the stage wiping their eyes. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the audience and said, "How many of y'all got somebody you wish you could have said goodbye to?" Dozens of hands went up. "How many of y'all got a promise you never kept?" More hands. Then this ain't just Earl's game. This is for all of us. Steve turned back to the game board, picked up his microphone, and said, "Earl, we're gonna play this game. And we're gonna win it. Not for the money. Not for the prizes. But because 50 years ago, a little boy named Tommy believed in you. And today you showed up. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. The game started. But it wasn't a game anymore. Every answer Earl gave, Steve treated like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. When Earl got an answer right, Steve celebrated like they just won the Super Bowl. When he got one wrong, Steve said, "Tommy would be proud just watching you try." The Thompson family didn't win. They came in second. But when the final buzzer sounded, Steve called Earl back to center stage. "This jacket," Steve said, pointing to the one still draped over Earl's shoulders, "is yours. I want you to keep it. Not because it's expensive, but because I want you to know that today you kept your promise. Tommy was here, and I was honored to witness it." Earl broke down. His family surrounded him. The other family joined in. And for 5 minutes, Family Feud became something it was never designed to be, a place of healing. When the taping wrapped, Steve walked Earl backstage personally. He didn't rush off to the next taping. He sat with Earl in the green room, asked him about Tommy, looked at photos on Earl's phone, and told him, "You're a good man. Don't ever forget that." Before Earl left, Steve handed him something else, his personal business card. "If you ever need anything, you call me. I mean that." Earl Thompson walked out of that studio with Steve Harvey's jacket, a business card, and something he hadn't felt in 50 years, peace. 3 weeks later, Steve received a letter. It was from Earl's daughter. She wrote, "My father died last Tuesday. It was peaceful. He was wearing your jacket. In his final hours, he kept saying, 'I did it. I kept my promise. Thank you for giving him that.'" Steve read that letter on his radio show. He cried again. And then he said something that would become one of his most quoted lines. "We think we're just entertaining people. But sometimes, if we pay attention, we get to do something bigger. We get to help somebody heal." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The jacket now hangs in Steve Harvey's office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that behind every contestant, every audience member, every person he meets, there's a story. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop, listen, and show up. But the story doesn't end with Earl's passing. Because what happened that day in the Family Feud studio created ripples that continued to spread. Within 48 hours of the episode airing, the network received over 50,000 emails. Not complaints. Not criticism. Letters. Letters from people sharing their own stories of promises they never kept, goodbyes they never got to say, siblings they lost too soon. One woman wrote, "I watched your show with my father, who has Alzheimer's. When Steve put that jacket on Earl, my dad turned to me and said I need to call my brother. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. Because of what you aired, they reconciled before my uncle passed away last month." Another letter came from a veteran. "I lost my best friend in combat 20 years ago. I promised his mother I'd visit her every year. I stopped going after year 3. Watching Earl reminded me that it's never too late. I went to see her last weekend. She cried. So did I. Thank you." Steve read every single one. He didn't assign it to an assistant. He sat in his office late at night, reading story after story of healing, of people finally letting go of guilt they'd been carrying for decades. And it changed him. In interviews after that episode, Steve talked about Earl constantly. "That man taught me something I'll never forget," he said on his radio show. "We go through life thinking we're too late. Too late to apologize. Too late to make amends. Too late to keep a promise. But Earl showed me that showing up, even 50 years late, still matters. It still counts." Steve started incorporating this into his own life. He reached out to old friends he'd lost touch with. He made amends with people he'd hurt during his climb to success. He became more present, more intentional, more willing to stop and listen when someone needed him to. The producers of Family Feud noticed the change too. Steve started asking contestants deeper questions. Not just, "What do you do for work?" but, "What brings you joy? Who are you here for? What does this mean to you?" The show became different. Still fun, still high energy, still full of Steve's trademark humor. But now there was something else woven into it: humanity. Real, raw, unscripted humanity. Earl's daughter later revealed that in her father's final days, he watched the episode over and over. He'd pause it at the moment Steve put the jacket on him, she said. And he'd say, "I did it, Tommy. We did it." He died with no regrets. That's the greatest gift anyone ever gave him. Steve keeps a photo on his desk. It's not a professional shot. It's not from a red carpet or an award show. It's a grainy cell phone picture taken backstage that day, Steve and Earl, sitting side by side, the jacket draped over Earl's shoulders, both of them smiling through tears. Underneath the photo, Steve wrote 5 words in Sharpie. "Never too late to listen. But perhaps the most profound impact came from an unexpected place. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve received a package. Inside was a worn baseball, a faded photo of 2 young boys, and a handwritten note. "Dear Mr. Harvey, I'm Tommy's son. I never knew my father. He died before I was born. But because of what you did for my Uncle Earl, I finally understand who my dad was. Earl gave me this baseball and told me stories I'd never heard. Thank you for giving my uncle peace, and for giving me my father's memory. The boy in this photo with the big smile? That's my dad. He would have loved Family Feud. He would have loved you." Steve framed that photo too. It sits right next to the one of him and Earl. 2 brothers, frozen in time, reminding him every single day why he does what he does. Earl Thompson kept a promise 50 years late. Steve Harvey honored it. And in doing so, both men proved that it's never too late to heal, to forgive yourself, and to finally say goodbye. Tommy would have been proud. And somewhere, somehow, Earl knows it.